Let me introduce you to a book that's about to be released. It's a book on religious freedom written by Irfan Engineer, who is the director for the Center of Study of Society and Secularism. The book looks like this: The Status of Freedom of Religion or Belief in India since 2014. So it's an investigation of the actual status of the freedom of religion, as enshrined in the Constitution of India, not just in Article 25 but also in Article 19 and Article 21, with which of course the book does not deal. But it's a very comprehensive recording of the various communal rights that have happened in India during the period under investigation, which is 2014 to 2024, nearly 10 years. And the book will be released in Kottayam. The flyer reads like this: National Colloquium 2024, The Status of Freedom of Religion in India. Mark Chrysostom Chair, Mahatma Gandhi University, in association with Center for the Study of Society and Secularism, Mumbai. And I'm only one of the speakers there. The others include Dr. C.T. Arvind Kumar, who is the Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University. Then, apart from the author, Sri Irfan Engineer, there are others like Sri M.A. Baby, who is a permanent fixture on the cultural landscape of Kerala. Then there is R. Rajgopal, who is editor-at-large of the Telegraph, a newspaper in which I have published several articles. Then a very distinguished priest from the Syrian Orthodox Church, Father Dr. K.M. George, who is also the Mar Gregorius Chair of MG University. He represents Mar Gregorius. And I have delivered a lecture under the auspices of this chair, I think a couple of years ago. And this function will take place at 10:30 a.m. on the 1st of October in the Convergence, in the conference hall, Convergence Academia Complex of MG University. If you happen to be in Kottayam and if you want to attend this function, you're welcome. Even if you don't, you're not going to miss much. But it'll be a good thing to keep in touch with some of these things if you have the time and the inclination. But let me take this opportunity to share some basic thoughts with you on freedom of religion, because what happens in exercises like this is that a forum is packed with many speakers, all of whom are very good resource persons. All of them deserve to be heard, but unfortunately what happens is that the little time gets crowded with people, as a result of which none gets the leisure, the time to develop even a single strain of thoughts to any satisfactory extent. So I would expect the same thing to happen here too, but I decided to accept the invitation largely because I do have something to say on freedom of religion, and I believe I have something very different to say on the subject as compared to almost everybody else. Of course, in accepting an invitation of this kind, I also run a risk of which I am not unaware, because when you participate in a colloquium, the extent to which you are free to depart from the dominant trend of thought would be very limited. So the irony, of course, is that you may be participating in a colloquium on freedom of religion, but you may not have the freedom to be radical and radically different from what others are advocating. It doesn't matter. I thought simply by being different, being there as a different voice has some value. That's why I'm going there. Again, as I say, if you happen to be interested and if you have time, do come. I'll be happy to meet with anyone who cares to come. So, let me say something very preliminary about freedom of religion. But before that, let me give you some idea of the contents of this book. This book starts with a very concise history of the evolution of legislation regarding freedom of religion, both in terms of the various human rights codes that have been formulated over a period of time, and in terms of particular legislations within India. But where the book is seriously limited is that it doesn't really have a good enough perspective on religious freedom or an adequate understanding of the various dimensions of religious freedom, particularly lacks a spiritual understanding of religious freedom. Let me give you an example. Just for our own line of thinking, this is not to belittle the author. I have to say that the author has done a tremendous piece of work in terms of chronicling the hundreds of religious rights, communal rights that have taken place. Now, if you look at freedom, human freedom is limited by two factors, or human freedom can be protected at least by two factors, of which law is only one. There is another factor which is equally important, though it is not usually recognized, and that is public opinion. Public opinion. Now, for example, if you happen to live in a society where the public opinion is that everybody should have equal right to bring their religious practices into the public domain, then you have a fair amount of religious freedom to practice certain customs, rites and observations regarding your religion. Whereas, if you happen to belong to a society where the public opinion, the dominant opinion that prevails is that this right to bring the practices of their religion into the public domain must be reserved only to the dominant religious group, then there is a problem. And over the last 10 years, this notion has crept in and is now consolidating itself, but the book says nothing about it. The book also says nothing about what you must do or how you are to use your religious freedom. And that is because from start to finish it assumes that freedom is something that is granted to you by an agency external to yourself. Now, external conditions are certainly important in determining the scope and substance of your freedom, but if you are not capable of utilizing your freedom, then of what avail is that? So, freedom is a matter of a continuous interplay between your state of inner freedom and the freedom that is obtained in the public domain or the social matrix or context to which you belong. So, it is the interplay between you and your context, and the book investigates, as almost every publication, every article I have read on the subject does, deals only with the external conditionalities, which I believe is a seriously limiting function. Whereas, if you look at Jesus's idea, you will find that he puts the emphasis more on yourself, your capacity for freedom. But before I come to that, let me give you a brief idea of the contents of this book. Again, let me show you this once again. The status of freedom of religion in India since 2014 by Irfan Engineer. The book begins with a brief history of freedom of religion. Then it proceeds to a chronicling of the hundreds of communal rights that have happened. Then it deals with some concluding remarks then it proceeds to a set of 15 recommendations. These recommendations again are limited to one particular angle of consideration which I have already indicated. So, as a handbook of information on the extent and spread of communal rights in India, and therefore the extent to which freedom of religion is constrained and is being increasingly constrained, this is a very timely publication. So, from the information point of view, I have no hesitation in recommending this book. But then you have to go beyond the substance of the book. Having made use of the book, you have to go beyond the scope of the book and think for yourself if you have a spiritual concern or a spiritual understanding of religious freedom. That is of course left to the reader, which is not a bad thing really. Now, let me for the next 10-15 minutes only deal with the basic substance of religious freedom as I understand it. To me, law is a far lower priority than considerations other than law. That is because my thinking on the subject, as on most other subjects, is influenced, inspired by the outlook of Jesus Christ, to whom law was a very, very small, almost an insignificant concern. The reason for that is very clear and it must be understood. According to Jesus, the importance of law increases even as the development of human beings in terms of their humanity decreases. So, there is a relationship of negative correlation between the dominance of law in a society and the development of human beings as persons who have developed their humanity to at least a certain minimum degree. In other words, the more humanly underdeveloped a society is, the more all human rights, not only freedom of religion, all fundamental human rights will be abrogated or constrained or threatened one way or another. So, unless and until the question of the inspired development of human beings in a society is addressed with the clarity of thought, the wisdom that it takes, then we really can't deal with the subject. The more you investigate the subject, the more you develop an image of yourself as a victim. And thinking of yourself as a victim is a serious problem, because a victim is by definition one who cannot help his condition, and therefore one who cannot do anything about his condition to change it, and one who does not have any sense of responsibility concerning his own predicament, which according to a spiritual perspective is a lie, because there is always something you can do about it, no matter how hopeless your situation seems. Certainly you can do something in relation to your own development, because the sum total of your development does not depend on your environment or the conditions external to you. Certain aspects will certainly will, but not everything about your personal development depends on conditions external to you, because human beings are not 100% victims or playthings in the hands of circumstantial forces and compulsions. We have to a certain extent freedom of choice and action, though that freedom of choice and action is not absolute. If it were absolute, then there would have been no problem. We live in a very limited and limiting scheme of things, and therefore whatever powers and properties we have will all be limited. But the interesting thing is that human beings are given the very special and unique power to work against these limiting conditions, against these odds, and to make creditable progress And that's the challenge of being human. And those who do not want to accept this challenge, for whatever reasons, embrace the idea of themselves as victims and indulge in self-pitying, which actually degrades them more and more into personal impotence and the misery that goes with it. So, when I think of freedom of religion, I think of two important aspects, and that's at the bare minimum level, two important aspects. And when I reveal those two aspects, you may initially laugh at me, but never mind, let me do it all the same. I think of freedom of religion in terms of being of two opposite states. One is the state of belonging, and the other the state of being the outsider. To practice religious freedom in a meaningful manner, you have to be at once a member as well as the outsider. Just as psychologists tell us that the human psyche, our mind, works in terms of love and hate, love-hate relationship, which is true, because the human condition always works in terms of a continuing dialogue between the opposites. It's a reconciliation of the opposites. By the way, it's opportune for me to mention here that the concept of logos, as it was evolved by Heraclitus 6 centuries before Jesus, the concept of logos, which John adopts in writing his gospel, which is the fourth gospel, and Christians think that John is the originator of the concept of logos, whereas he's simply borrowing it. And John expounds the significance of Jesus using a heathen concept. Can you believe this? The Christians will be shocked when they come to know of this. Anyway, that's not my main concern here. Maybe another occasion we'll be able to look at it. So when Heraclitus, 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 developed this concept of logos, one of his main points of emphasis was that the logos was the connecting principle in the whole of the cosmos. Everything is held together by the logos, which of course is also understood as reason in another context. So now when the logos is understood as the power that connects, Heraclitus would say what the logos connects in particular and holds together are opposites. For example, if you have to have a day, you have to have day and night, two completely contrary things. One is light and the other is absence of light. So everything involves the reconciliation of the opposites. Now, in the same manner, I understand religious freedom in terms of the reconciliation of two opposites. One is belonging. If you don't belong anywhere and if you are only living in, all alone on an island, then there is no the concept of religious freedom makes no sense. You don't even have to talk about it, such a concept will not even arise. The need for religious freedom, the need to protect religious freedom arises precisely because there are people other than you. And at any rate, religion would not have arisen but for the presence of other people. At the same time, religion also cripples your ability to relate peacefully, meaningfully and humanely with other people, to other people. Now that's another paradox. Okay. So what are these two seeming contradictions which must be reconciled if religious freedom is to become real? One is you have to belong, and the other is you have to be an outsider. Now the most interesting thing is this: when we think meaningfully of religious freedom, the more fundamental of the two is the need to be the outsider, and only secondarily the need to belong. This again might seem very strange to you, but let me explain. You have to be the outsider in relation to your religious community, and you have to be the insider in relation to the wider community. Only then can religious freedom be practiced in a meaningful fashion. Now, let us take the idea of being the outsider to your own religious community. Your religious community, your church, if your religious community is organized at all, if it's a completely informal, unorganized kind of a fellowship, then this problem doesn't exist as acutely. It still will exist wherever there is belief, wherever there is zeal, wherever there is piety, wherever there is strong sentiment for what one believes, the problem will always exist, but its acuity or acuteness will vary according to the degree to which a religious tradition is organized, and organized in a legalistic manner according to certain constitutions, laws, provisions, codes, canons, etc. Now, you cannot and you will not find a single church anywhere in the world which gives you freedom, what's called freedom of conscience. Now, if you read Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, you will find that it's a freedom of conscience. Basically, freedom of religion is understood in the Indian Constitution as freedom of conscience, and it is granted. Article 25 is a right, a fundamental right conferred on persons. The word used in that article is persons, not communities. Because freedom of conscience makes sense only with respect to individuals and not with respect to a community. Conscience applies to individuals, and therefore Article 25 deals with the religious plight of individuals, and it says that every person will have and must have the freedom to practice, preach and propagate his or her faith. Actually, it doesn't say his or her faith, practice religion, that's all. Practice, preach, propagate religion. It's very cleverly formulated. So, every person in India will have the freedom to practice, preach and propagate religion. Going by that, by the provision of that article, as a Christian, I should have the freedom to practice, preach and propagate Hinduism, Islam, Sikh religion, so on and so forth. But the question is, will my church give me that freedom? Certainly will not. Now, leave alone this wider scope of religious freedom according to conscience. Now, for example, in some of my previous videos, I referred to the Gita and certain Hindu philosophical concepts in a very positive light, and it certainly made some Christians unhappy. So, according to them, I should not have the freedom to see what is good, what is beautiful in other religious traditions. So, I should not be free. Now, certainly, when it comes to the leadership of various churches, this problem becomes far more acute. I am already labeled a heretic, an infidel, an enemy of Christianity, so on and so forth. So, freedom of conscience is nil. Within organized religious communities, or if you like, churches, there, if you really want to exercise religious freedom, you have to be an outsider. I'm not saying that you have to exit or sever your connection with the community. You have to, you can stay inside the organized religious community, but to exercise your freedom at all, you have to live as though you are the outsider, or what is called the inside outsider. The inside outsider. Okay? So you have to really protect your freedom of conscience against your own community. This is what this book doesn't talk about, because it's not talked about. It's not fashionable to talk about. If you talk about things like this, you'll be immediately branded and will be viewed with a lot of fear, apprehension, suspicion, etc. So this is the first thing why I say that you can't practice freedom of religion and freedom of conscience unless you're also the outsider in relation to your own community, faith community. Then I say that you have to belong, which is exactly the opposite of the other. You have to belong to the wider community. Now, it is because religious minorities in India, particularly Muslims and Christians, have systematically alienated themselves from the national mainstream, that their right to exercise the constitution guaranteed freedom of religion has come under unprecedented stress and strain. In other words, you cannot live for yourself relating to the national mainstream only for what you can get out of it, without showing a corresponding reciprocal sense of national consciousness, obligation, and responsibility. If you think only for yourself and not for the total entity called the nation, then you knowingly or unknowingly undermine the scope of your religious freedom. After all, the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of religion, as enshrined in Article 25 of the Constitution, is part of a secular democratic constitutional democracy. So how can you claim one part of it without accepting the rest? The overall nature of the Indian polity is India is a socialist, secular, democratic republic. Now, I request you to consider, is socialism acceptable to any religious community, particularly Christians and Muslims? Is secularism acceptable to its leadership? Is democracy acceptable? The democratic principle. For example, in 2009, the Law Commission, under the chairmanship of the late Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, formulated what's called the Church Bill. And the main scope of that bill is that the members of every church must have some degree of control over the assets of the community, their own assets. All the bishops in Kerala united and put up stiff resistance against making this recommendation the law of the land via legislation. Even today, it has not been taken up for legislation. So, what the Church Bill of 2009, which was subsequently modified by Justice K.T. Thomas Commission, not very substantially, but in certain respects, what the Church Bill envisages is the introduction of a small dose of democracy, not much, a small dose of democracy into the governance of the church. Is that acceptable to the leaders of the church? Not at all. But they must have freedom of religion. Freedom of religion for whom? Not for the members of the church, only for themselves. Now, let's take another aspect. Christians and Muslims believe in conversion, proselytization. They believe that they have a constitutionally protected right to go and convert people and swell their ranks. They have not succeeded at all, but they make all kinds of claims which are laughable. While they believe in the justness of their right to go preach, propagate, and as a result influence others to their own advantage, namely increase their ranks numerically, will they respect the same right for others? Will they allow Hindus or Sikhs or whoever, other religions, to come into their midst and to proselytize? No, not at all. Because that is betraying their God. Now, this hypocrisy cuts the very root of freedom of religion, as stated in Article 25 of the Indian Constitution. Now, let's take another article, Article 19. Article 19 guarantees to, again, all persons, freedom of thought. Is there any church which grants to its members freedom of thought and expression vis-a-vis whatever the conscience of the individual feels very strongly about regarding the articles of faith, or the scriptures that are taught, or the customs and practices that are in vogue, all of which are pretty ancient? They may have been relevant 500 years ago, but they're completely out of place today. But if anyone dares to say a word critical of it, they would be silenced forever. I have innumerable personal experiences which I can cite, but for want of time, I'm not going to do it. Or consider another article, Article 21, which also guarantees to people, to citizens, to individuals, freedom of life and liberty. The other was freedom, Article 19 was freedom of thought. Article 29 is freedom of life and liberty. And various Supreme Court interpretations of the scope of Article 21, there are several of them, consistently maintain that right to life does not mean right to mere existence, but right to live with freedom and dignity. And human dignity certainly involves freedom of thought, apart from freedom of movement, freedom of expression, so on and so forth, freedom of organization, freedom to work, freedom to be educated. Through a constitutional amendment, the right to education also became incorporated into the scope of Article 21, as you know, 21A. So, we're dealing with a very comprehensive issue, but unfortunately, when we write about religious freedom, we tend to really narrow the scope of all of that and focus only on what is being done to us. Certainly very unpleasant and unjustifiable things are being done to the religious minorities, particularly Hindus and Christians. There is an ideological background to this, which I don't want to take up now for discussion. There is a lot to be desired. Things are not ideal. Things are not even pleasant. But it's equally true that we have to put our own houses in order. The situation within is as unfortunate, as regrettable, I would say more regrettable, than the conditions outside of our religious community. That's why I say that when in the Indian context we think of the scope and the dynamics of religious freedom, the best way to do this honestly, with any degree of factual appropriateness and contextual relevance and truthfulness to our own line of thinking, is to understand it in terms of the interplay between two opposites, namely the duty or the compulsion to be the outsider inside, and the duty also to belong, the outsider in relation to your own immediate religious community, the insider in relation to the wider society, because only when you belong to the wider society will you have the wisdom and the larger perspective, which is essential if you have to be a responsible and sane inside-outsider to your community, which I believe is the quintessence of the prophetic and the affirmative role an individual has to play vis-a-vis his own religious community. So ultimately, I would say, as I've said on many occasions in the past 30, 35 years, I would maintain that freedom of religion can never be complete or sane without freedom from religion. Now, I made a very radical statement, I am aware of it. This is not the occasion for me to defend that statement, but if my viewers want to initiate a discussion on this, I'm quite happy to take that point, that reflection further on, and I think we should continue to debate issues like this in order to attain clarity My conviction is that nothing is clearly understood until it is honestly debated without any fear of failure. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.